They laughed when the gavel fell at $30, and the dust off the saloon doors coughed like an old man trying to stand. And he said he would take it as is, roof holes and all, and the clerk blinked as if 30 was a joke that had wandered him from the road. And someone in the crowd called it dead wood and dead whiskey and dead luck, and asked who buys a room full of broken chairs and a sign that still smelled of old fights. And he said quiet, that value doesn't vanish because people say a word for long enough. And someone muttered that a fool had just bought himself a broom and a grave, and he nodded once, as if agreeing to be underestimated, as if signing a pact with the road and the wind, and the town's mouthpiece lifted his shoulders and said to sell it back by sundown while the price still covered a night's meal. And the newcomer said no and looked up at the second-story windows where glass panes wore grime like a veil and where a crooked curtain showed a thumbprint of light. And the promise hung there, thin as a wire. The price is low. The cost is coming. The worth will flip, and when it does, you'll remember who laughed and who kept count. He didn't smile. He pushed through, set his palm to the warped door, felt it resist and groan like a mule, let the hinges speak their complaint, and stepped inside with his eyes taking inventory while his hand found a match, and the match found flame, and the flame found the old lantern, and the lantern found the dusty ribs of this place's chest. Air tasted like stale tobacco and wet ash. Floors wore spikes of nail heads like tiny eyes, bar top scarred with knife arcs and ring stains, mirror cracked into A. Geography of mistakes. He walked slow, boots whispering across grit, paused where the floor dipped 3 boards over from the old piano, and the dip was like the others. It held, not sag but intent, as if weight had lived there that didn't belong to footsteps. And he pressed it with his heel and listened for a difference, and difference answered, a muted hollow that spoke of a pocket under the skin. And he knelt palm flat, feeling a coolness that didn't match the room's heat, a seam, catching his fingertips like a buried thread. He followed it to the wall and saw marks of casual I would call accidents, a cluster of faint notches that matched others he'd already seen carved on the backs of chairs and the underside of bar lip. Not random, not drunken whittling, but a language of space and angle. He whispered numbers he knew from another life, not gamblers' numbers but surveyors, and the patterns sharpened into coordinates. Upstairs, a step creaked without weight, and the ceiling gave a soft exhale, and he heard, under the house's old bones, a patient watcher settling in. Maybe wind, maybe someone who had learned to walk like wind, and he let the silence lengthen until the building told him nothing else, then stood, moved behind the bar, found the trap behind a stack of crates where a stain shaped like a handprint had bled outward years ago. The trap wasn't the hollow, not yet. Only a decoy where everyone had already looked too many times. Bottles shattered. And wood rotted. But the iron ring was clean, as if used last week, not decades ago. He didn't pull it. He took the stairs instead. Left hand grazing the banister. Right hand wrapped around nothing in particular. Just the air that could become a fist if needed. And each riser spoke under him. 1 to 3. The 4th a whisper. The 5th a hinged squeal. The 6th quiet, and he catalogued it the way a hunter catalogues a wind. At the landing he paused and looked to the left where doors once welcome paid laughter, and to the right where a narrow hall ended in a window fogged from the inside. On the left, one door carried the same notches as the scene below, but they were higher, 3 fingers above the knob, and the pattern declared a relationship to the floor dip below like the key to a lock that pretends not to exist. Someone had been careful, and then someone had been careless, and time had made a treaty between them both. He pushed into the left room, slow, and the air inside was colder as if the walls remembered winter. Bed frame broken, mattress gutted, a chair that had survived by standing on 3 legs and pride. Under the window, the wallpaper blistered, and the blisters lined up with the pattern's grid. He pressed, and the paper gave, not like rot, like cover. Beneath it, thin planks ran cross-grained and cut shorter than the wall, as if a hand had measured the distance in secrecy. A rasp of boot leather sounded in the hall and then stilled, and he said to the air, "If you're here for the $30, it's gone." And the air said nothing, which is how fear negotiates, and then a voice he would later name his notes, simply as a mouth said from the doorframe, "We don't collect small bills. We collect mistakes." And stepped into view with 2 shadows behind him that matched his height, the way echo matches voice. The mouse hat brim hid his eyes, but not the smile in his cheeks, the kind of smile that knows where the sheriff eats and where men sleep when the wind turns. And the mouth glanced at the corner where the wallpaper didn't quite meet the baseboard and said, "You'll find a little nothing. You'll sell at a fair loss. Or you'll donate it to civic improvement and walk away with our thanks. Doors like this close on people. The newcomer turned his palm on the blistered paper until the glue pulled away like tired scab, revealing the cross-grained panel, and on it, a tiny circle burned into the wood. Not a brand, not a knot, a deliberate sun the size of a thumbnail, and in its center that had been pressed with something cold. He whispered, marks that repeat, marks that speak, and the mouth smile straightened. You can repeat them to yourself. The mouth said, out loud isn't recommended. The newcomer lifted the chair, laid it gently on its side to clear the space, and put ear to wood. From below, water talked to itself in the pipes, and behind it a dense quiet like paper stacked under weight. He had learned in his other life that paper is heavier than it looks when it carries names. He reached in his pocket and took out a small metal wedge, the only tool that had survived the trip besides his hands, slid into the seam, and the bore resisted, then sighed up a hair's breadth. The mouth stepped forward, and one shadow leaned a palm near his belt. I'll buy you out for 5 times what you paid, the mouth said, and the room's cold flinched at the word buy. Sell now and walk away, one shadow added, and the newcomer said. Or stand here and be counted. Not looking at them, just speaking the line as if it had waited in the wood for him to say it. The mouth's cheek went smooth. Don't know how things work here, he said. I know how weight works, the newcomer said, and levered the board. It rose with sticky reluctance, breath of old air escaping like a kept story, and beneath, not hollow but a second skin of planks, narrower, with brass heads marking positions like stars. He pressed each in the order the notches had taught him. Left, top, bottom, right, pause, left again, and on the 5th touch the second skin clicked, and something above them answered, a minute clack in the ceiling joist. The mouse head tilted toward that sound despite himself. A code had spoken, and something had listened. You're going to make friends with trouble, the mouth said quietly. Trouble already saved me once, the newcomer said, and stood, crossed the door, and looked down the hall toward a fog window. The fog wasn't fog. It was paint on the exterior glass, a film meant to keep horses from spooking at movement inside. He smiled with only the corner of his mouth and stepped past him into the hall, not conceding space, just borrowing it, and returned to the landing where his boot counted the stairs again and stopped at the 4th with a whisper. He pressed the riser with both thumbs and felt give. Pulled. A strip of molding came away to reveal an iron lever sunk into the joist, damp with the oil of a careful hand. He squeezed, and upstairs in the left room which slid against wood, and the bed frame shuddered as if woken. He returned to find the wall had opened at shin height, not a door but a drawer long as a bed, and inside lay a ledger bound in dull green cloth with a faded stamp in the corner, and next to it a satchel collapsed around something, squared off and dense. When he lifted the ledger, the satchel exhaled a clink of metal like coin against plate, but the weight said otherwise. He didn't open either. Not yet. He looked at the mouth and said, I'll need witnesses. The mouth said, You'll need a doctor, and one shadow smiled with his fingers. I'll call the marshal, the newcomer said, and the mouth's eyebrows didn't move, but the line of his jaw did the work of frown. The marshal keeps hours, he said. Paper keeps longer, the newcomer said. He set the ledger on the floorboards as if placing a stone on a grave and opened it to the first page, and the first page spoke in neat hand. Dates, payments, names, amounts, columns of figures that made sense in the language of fines and levies, and beside those, in a different hand, a second column that matched the first like a shadow matches the man, off by a constant and hidden behind a code of marks that were identical to the notches hidden through the building. Old receipts pinned to pages, with rusted tacks, wax seals cracked but legible, a small square cloth with sheriff's star stitched at the corner to serve as a private cipher. The sheriff, who had once kept order here, had kept a second order, a parallel river of coin that turned at select banks, and the ledger told it without apology. The mouth inhaled through his nose and held it as if scent were a weapon. Close it, he said. It isn't for you. The newcomer traced a date with his fingertip, a day that the town had celebrated a raid or a seizure, and the columns told how celebration had been filleted for private tables. It is exactly for me, he said, because I paid $30 for a room full of names. The mouth stepped closer until the brim shadow swallowed half the page. Sell me the book and walk, he said. Sell me the walls that hide it. Sell me your memory of it. Sell me the smell of it. 10 times. 20. The newcomer shook his head and said, soft as cotton, that would be unwise, and the mouth's smile lost its commas. Are you threatening me? He said. I'm trying to save your life, the newcomer replied, and closed the ledger without hurry and slid it into the satchel and felt the other object there with his knuckles, hard corners, and a face of etched metal, not coin, a small device with needle and a dial and letters around the rim worn by a thumb, a cheap surveyor's transit or a customs gauge, the kind used when goods are weighed for tax. It would match the figures if tested. We'll take that, one shadow said, and the newcomer reached into the satchel again, took the device out, held it at face level, and let the lantern light find the etch. Not letters for vanity, but initials that matched the stitched star on the cloth square, and the mouth's eyes, hidden before, showed themselves with a tired flare. You're climbing a rope that burns, he said. Come down before the skin peels. From the street, hooves beat a brief drum. A voice below called a name not his, a summons for a different man, and then the call died like it had been shoved into a pocket. They were being surrounded only by the idea of being surrounded, not yet the fact. We do this by day, in the open, the newcomer said. We do this with witnesses and with the law. The mouth said, the law eats at my table, and the newcomer said, sometimes the bill arrives anyway, and moved, faster than talk, past the shadow who reached but grabbed air into the hallway, down the whispering stair, through the broken bar where the dust wrote its own language in the sun, and out the front door into a crowd that had already assembled because towns hear footsteps the way a lake hears a thrown stone. Faces slid toward him like a single face. Someone asked at the roof. Had fallen in. Someone else remarked he must be ready to sell. He said, I bought a record, and they laughed because records meant music or court, and in either case their laughter liked it. He raised a satchel and said, proof, and the word cut the air narrower. The mouth and his two shadows came behind him like a thought trying to change his mind, and the mouth said, civic-minded stranger found old paper and old wood. We'll tend to it. But a woman near the front, hair wrapped in a kerchief the color of faded marigold, said, we'll tend to it with our eyes. And the man who ran the feed store added, and with the marshals, and the newcomer said, please fetch him. And 3 boys took off at once, because running with purpose is a luxury. The crowd pressed but left a sliver of space as if the satchel had grown invisible teeth. The mouth looked down the street, where dust hung, and no one official yet moved. Within it, and he said, soft for the newcomer, last offer, and named a number that could have bought the building and the 2 nearest besides. And the newcomer said, this isn't an offer, this is a count, and lifted the ledger and opened to a page where the column watched its shadow, and he read a name and a sum and a date and a purpose. Road repairs after flood, and read the second sum that had not reached the road, and a hush fell in sections, first at the front, then mid-crowd, then the back where laughter went to retire. The woman in a marigold kerchief closed her hand around the hem, like she could steady herself by cloth. A man who had never liked the sheriff because. People like him always keep a private dislike ready, said, say it again, and he did, and then another name and another sum, this time the levy for stolen cattle compensation, and the shadow column that found its own corral. He turned the gauge in his hand and said, this is how weight lied, and spun the needle, and the needle, even now, fell not to 0 but to a mark hidden beneath a lip of brass. Someone in the crowd cursed in a church voice, someone who had lost a sister to a winter that might have been averted if the levy had become flour instead of ghost money, set his jaw until the skin whitened. The mouth set the air. Paper's tricks. Men remember wrong. Winter lies. And the newcomer lifted the small cloth square with the stitched star and laid it across the ledger's page like a signature returning to claim its own ink. The crowd inhaled. The boys returned with the marshal, who arrived not like a savior, but like a man bringing rain to a field that might still fail. The marshal had a face made of choices, and he looked first at the mouth, and then at the book, and then at the cloth, and then at the device, and then at the newcomer's eyes, and the sequence mattered. He said, where? And the newcomer pointed up and said, hidden in the wall by a hand that liked order. And the marshal said, who? And the newcomer lowered his voice and whispered a name that the cloth implied, and the ledger confirmed. And it was a name the town had cheered for years, because men cheered a hand that holds a gavel that spares their day-to-day discomforts. But a murmur turned like a herd shifting weight. The mouth said, this is theater, marshal. And the marshal said, theater charges admission. and put his palm to the ledger like a priest swearing a child to a different life, and asked, "Hand?" And the newcomer said, "Not yet. Witness first," and read aloud again, this time 3 entries that formed a line from a flood to a levy to a foreclosure that had followed, all within a month that had also seen a dance at the hall where the sheriff made a speech about duty. And the pages said the speech had been a veil drawn over a hand moving coin into a pocket with initials. The marshal took out a pencil that looked too soft and too short for what it now had to do and made a small mark next to a date. His own mark, not to claim but to anchor. The mouth's shadow shifted like men who understood geography, and the mouth's mouth said, almost kindly, "If you keep speaking that name, you will not get to finish it." And the newcomer said, "That is why I am speaking outside, where finishing is a public duty." And he lifted the device and asked the marshal to set it against the feed store scale, and the marshal did, and the needle fell to the hidden mark, and the feed store man fetched his own weight from back, the one his father had, used, older and less pretty, and set it on the scale, and the difference stood there like a child with a hand in a jar, who refuses to retract it. The marshal said nothing and reached out and took the ledger and the device and the cloth square, and the order of the taking mattered because he took evidence, mechanism, symbol, as of stacking the case brick by brick, and he looked at the mouth and said, "Where did you first learn the pattern?" And the mouth smiled without his cheeks moving this time, and said, "I sell sugar and I sell salt. Patterns belong to the buyer." And the marshal said, "You will sell your afternoon to me," and nodded to men who wore the town's badge, who had waited at the edge trying to be furniture. They stepped forward, not to arrest the mouth, but to set him aside while the street gathered its breath. The crowd's murmur had lost its edges, become one thing. A woman said, "My levy," and a man said, "My boy," and someone else, the quietest of the 3, said, "Our road." And the marshal looked at the newcomer and said, "Upstairs," and the 2 men, "With us," and the procession moved, strange and slow, back through the saloon door that objected again like a mule, up the stair that whispered its count, into the left room where the cold still sat. The marshal knelt and touched the sliding panel, the cross-grained planks, the brass-head stars, and nodded as if greeting an old adversary whose tactics he finally recognized. He loved order, the marshal said. He feared it more, the newcomer replied, and the marshal slid the drawer fully open to reveal, behind where the ledger had lain, a thinner compartment with ribbon-tied packets of receipts and 3 small tin boxes with seals unbroken. And he broke one seal and lifted the lid, and found inside not coin, but slivers of lead trimmed to mimic weights, each marked on one face with a single diagonal cut, the code's simplest letter, and on the underside of 2 of them, a smear of blue wax that matched. The sheriff's private seal. The marshal made no sound this time, only set the box in the corner as if it could contaminate air, and stood. Downstairs a shout rose, boots scuffed. Someone ran. The marshal pivoted to the door, hand moving to habit on his belt, and the mouth's 2 shadows stood at the threshold like bookends. "We'll finish this now," one said, and the other moved a palm low, and the marshal said, "Choose, hide, or stand in the light," and the shadow with the palm low paused. Because even men who practice darkness understand the word light, and in that pause a newcomer stepped between them, not as shield as lever, turning bodies by making them decide whether to harm him in front of a lawman and a house full of paper that could haunt their daughters. They did not move. The marshal said, "Downstairs," and the procession reversed, and when they emerged into the street the day had tilted toward afternoon, and the crowd had grown by 24, and the mouth stood with his smile shelved and his eyes trying to calculate a world with fewer corners. And the marshal held the ledger up not as trophy but as mirror. "Names," he said, and the newcomer read, and the pages did what words do when they carry weight that cannot be redistributed. The sheriff did not appear because the summons had been sent through men who now carried a different loyalty, the kind that grows when evidence stands in sunlight. An older man stepped forward, the carpenter who had once laid the saloon's floor, hands clean despite the memory of pitch, and he said, "I can testify to the work. That seam was built to be found by a friend." And the marshal nodded, and the crowd let the carpenter's voice settle like tar. The mouth tried once more, leaning his words against old friendships. "The sheriff has saved your son from jail. He has eased your debts. You think a book outranks a kindness?" And the woman in the marigold kerchief answered, "A kindness that charged double." And the feed store man said, "A kindness paid by our dead." and the mouth's final argument swam for a moment and then drowned without a sound. The marshal lifted his palm, and the badges moved the edge of the crowd where the road met the hall and curled like a hand around a man in a coat that had not been made for heat. The sheriff stood there, not called but compelled by the vacuum that had formed where his name once lived, and he looked at the ledger and at the device and at the cloth and at the boxes, and his first words were not denial, not anger. They were weary. If he read a man's account aloud, read his donations too, and the woman said, "We did," and the calm of her voice cut him worse than any shout. He tried again with a story about floods and choices, about keeping a town upright when the river leaned hard, and the marshal let him speak until his sentences began to eat their tails, and then the marshal said, "Not rumor, paper, names, dates, payments, ink that does not burn," and the sheriff's jaw clicked once. He looked at the mouth and then passed him at the two shadows, and the shadows looked at their feet, because feet can betray you, and the sheriff, who had been a power broker because he could make the world feel slightly safer for a fee, made one last calculation and decided that the only safe table left was the laws. So he said, "If the book is to be believed, I am done. If not, this town is—" And the marshal said, "We'll believe the book and the boxes and the scale and the hands that built the seam and the hands that marked the weights." And then he said to the sheriff, "You can walk or you can be walked." And the sheriff looked at the crowd and saw not a mob but a mirror, and nodded once and put his hands in front as if to plead, but instead to be bound. And the rope the marshal used was simple and unadorned, and it made a sound like truth when it tightened. The town didn't cheer. They breathed. The newcomer closed the satchel and set it on the bar behind him and addressed the feed store man, and the carpenter and the woman and the boys and the silent man at the back, and said, "Road money goes to road, levy to levy, debt to none who did not owe it." And the marshal said, "The hall will hold records. This place will hold them, too." And the newcomer nodded because the building had done its penance and had earned a second life as a keeper rather than a keeper's accomplice. The mouth tried to slip sideways past responsibility, but the marshal's hand found his sleeve and said, without words, "Not yet." And the crowd made a small aisle that had not existed a moment earlier, and down that aisle walked a man with a ledger of his own, not a trap book, but a list of those who had been shorted, and another with a tool chest, and another with paint. Things that had been hidden would be cataloged and then set in order, first structurally, then morally. When the sun tipped to the rooftops, the newcomer stood in the doorway of the saloon and listened to boards breathe relief. He thought of the rope-burned memory in his palms from years when it climbed to fix other people's mistakes, thought of heat and weight and measure, thought of the thin seam between being humiliated in public and turning humiliation into a hinge. They had called him a fool at noon, and by evening they would call him the man who counted, not because he was clever, but because he'd been stubborn when offered an easy exit. He spoke once more of a crowd that still lingered, not to draw applause, only place a stone where others could see it. Crowd to witness, witness to will to law. Not a miracle, evidence. Not vengeance, accountability. The place that hid the secret becomes the place that keeps the record. They watched, they waited, they weighed. And when the marshal's men led the sheriff away, the town did not turn its face. It held his gaze as he passed, and in that steady look lived the first plank of a better floor.